Your pathetic husband is finally dead. So dry your tears, pack your worthless belongings, and get out of my house forever. My daughter-in-law screamed at me across the dinner table, while my son sat there like a coward, nodding in agreement. This mansion was never yours anyway, old woman. I walked out without saying a word. But the next morning I drove to Wells Fargo Bank in downtown Chicago, and what I discovered there would make them both pay dearly for their cruelty. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible story, and comment below what state you're watching from, so I can see how far my journey has reached across America. Trust me, what happens next will absolutely shock you. The grand dining room of our Victorian mansion in Lincoln Park felt haunted, without Richard's presence. The mahogany table, imported from England decades ago, had witnessed countless Thanksgiving dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet Sunday breakfasts. Now it seemed to mock me with its emptiness. Despite 3 people sitting around it, I kept glancing at his favorite chair, the one with the burgundy leather cushion that had molded perfectly to his body over 34 years of marriage. His reading glasses still sat on the side table, where he'd left them the night before his massive heart attack. The doctors said he didn't suffer, but I was suffering enough for both of us. It had been exactly 8 days since we buried my husband of 34 years. 8 days since I stood in that freezing February wind at Graceland Cemetery, watching them lower the love of my life into the frozen ground. The grief sat in my chest like a boulder, making every breath feel like I was drowning in sorrow. "Pass the mashed potatoes, Margaret," Stephanie snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. My daughter-in-law had perfected the art of saying my name like it was a curse word. But tonight, there was something different in her tone, something that made my skin crawl. I reached for the crystal serving bowl, a wedding gift from Richard's mother 40 years ago. My hands were still shaking from the emotional exhaustion of the funeral. At 73, I thought I'd prepared myself for this inevitable day. But nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache that followed me from room to room in this house, that suddenly felt too big and too empty. "These potatoes are cold," Stephanie complained, barely tasting them. "Don't you know how to keep food warm anymore?" Marcus, my 46-year-old son, sat between us like a referee in a boxing match he'd already rigged. He'd barely looked at me all evening, his attention focused entirely on his wife of 17 years. The little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms now couldn't even meet his grieving mother's eyes. "I'm sorry, dear," I whispered, starting to get up. "I can reheat them in the microwave." "Sit down, Margaret," Stephanie commanded. "We need to talk to you about something important." "The funeral was beautiful," I offered tentatively, desperate to fill the uncomfortable silence that had settled over us like a dark cloud. "Your father would have been so moved to see his old army buddies there. And Mrs. Henderson from next door. She's been bringing casseroles every day since." "Yes. Well, that's actually what we need to discuss," Stephanie interrupted, her voice taking on that false sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Margaret, we've been talking, and we're concerned about you living alone in this big house." Something in her tone made alarm bells ring in my head. I looked between her and Marcus, searching for any sign of genuine concern. Instead, I found cold calculation in Stephanie's green eyes and uncomfortable avoidance in my son's familiar brown ones. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Stephanie straightened in her chair, assuming that authoritative posture she used when delivering ultimatums to her children. I'd seen it before, usually when she was explaining why Marcus couldn't visit me as often, or why family traditions needed to change to accommodate her busy social schedule. "Marcus and I have been discussing your situation," she began, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Now that Richard is gone, This house is going to be far too much for you to handle alone. The maintenance, the property taxes, the utilities. It's all going to be overwhelming for someone your age. I blinked, confused and hurt. Too much? I've been managing this house for over 30 years. I know every creaky floorboard, every temperamental faucet, every quirk of the old heating system. That's exactly the problem, Stephanie continued, her mask of pleasantness slipping slightly. You're not getting any younger, Margaret. And let's be honest, maintaining a house this size is expensive. The property taxes alone are over $15,000 a year. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. Mum, Stephanie's right. The upkeep alone is going to be overwhelming for you. And with Dad gone, the finances. I'm not helpless. Marcus, I said, hearing my voice crack with emotion. This house. Your father and I saved every penny for 20 years to buy this place. We restored it room by room. Every corner holds memories of our life together. Stephanie's expression hardened like concrete. Memories don't pay utility bills or property taxes, Margaret. You need to be practical about this. I stared at this woman who had systematically pushed me out of my son's life for 17 years. The woman who had convinced Marcus that weekly dinners with his mother were too much pressure, and that holidays needed to be balanced between families, which somehow always meant more time with her relatives in Michigan. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, my voice trembling. We think you should look into one of those nice senior living communities, Stephanie said, her tone suggesting she was doing me the favor of a lifetime. Somewhere with activities and people your own age. It would be so much healthier for you than rattling around alone in this enormous house. I turned to Marcus, desperately hoping to see some sign that he disagreed with this plan. Marcus, you really think I should sell the house where you grew up? Where you took your first steps in that hallway? Where your father taught you to ride? A bike in the backyard? It makes sense, Mom, he interrupted, still avoiding my eyes. And honestly, Stephanie and I could really use the space. We've been talking about expanding our family, and this house has so much potential for renovation. The meaning behind his words crashed over me like a tsunami. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted my house, the home Richard and I had lovingly restored, room by room, over 3 decades of marriage. Now that your pathetic husband is finally dead, Stephanie's voice suddenly lost all pretense of civility. Dry your tears, pack your worthless belongings, and get out of my house forever. The words rolled off her tongue with casual cruelty, as if she was discussing throwing away old newspapers instead of evicting her husband's grieving mother. Marcus looked up then, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But then he smiled and nodded like a trained seal. She's right, Mom. This house was Dad's, and now it's mine. You were just living here all these years. I felt my world tilt on its axis. Just living here? The words came out as a whisper, as if 34 years of marriage, of building a life and raising a family, amounted to nothing more than extended house-sitting. I see, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Inside, something was breaking apart. Not just my heart, but my understanding of who my son was, who my family had become. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. I'll need some time to. 2 weeks. Stephanie cut me off sharply. That should be plenty of time to find somewhere suitable and arrange for movers. The realtor wants to list the house by the end of the month. 2 weeks. Not 2 months, not even a reasonable timeline to grieve and plan. 2 weeks to dismantle a lifetime of memories and dreams. Marcus finally looked directly at me, and what I saw there was worse than anger or hatred. It was complete, casual indifference to my pain. "It's for the best, Mom," he said, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "You'll see. This is actually a blessing in disguise." I walked upstairs to the master bedroom I'd shared with Richard for over 3 decades. Each step felt like climbing Mount Everest. The room still smelled like his cologne, that woody scent I'd bought him every Christmas for 20 years. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand where he'd left them, along with the biography of Winston Churchill he'd been reading. I sat on the edge of our 4-poster bed and stared at my reflection in the antique dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 73, her silver hair limp and lifeless, her blue eyes dulled by shock and grief. In 2 weeks, I would have to leave this room where I'd said goodbye to Richard just 8 days ago. I would have to pack up 34 years of marriage into cardboard boxes and surrender it all to a son who had just told me I'd never really belonged here anyway. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and shock. A small, hard kernel of determination that reminded me of the woman I used to be. The woman who had worked 2 jobs to help Richard build his law practice, who had raised a son while managing a household, who had survived the death of my first baby and found the strength to try again. Richard had always been the one who handled our finances, but he taught me to be thorough, to pay attention to details, to never sign anything without reading it first. Tomorrow, I would start making some calls. I would visit the bank and begin the process of figuring out exactly what I was entitled to. Because if Marcus and Stephanie thought they could just erase me from this family without consequence, they might be in for the surprise of their lives. The first thing I needed to do was understand exactly what Richard had left behind, and to whom. And something told me there might be more to discover than anyone realized. The morning sun felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as I sat alone at the breakfast table, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee. 12 days had passed since that horrific dinner, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to disappear. Marcus and Stephanie had already been by 3 times to assess the space, rooms, and discussing renovations as if I were already dead and buried. Yesterday, I'd overheard Stephanie on the phone with a contractor, scheduling estimates for once the old bat finally moves out. The drive to the main Wells Fargo branch in downtown Chicago took 45 minutes through the familiar streets I'd traveled with Richard for decades. I'd made this same journey hundreds of times, usually with Richard in the passenger seat, handling our banking while I waited in the car, reading magazines or watching people pass by. He'd always been protective of our financial information. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he said money matters gave me headaches and it was one less thing for my beautiful wife to worry about. Now I wished I'd paid closer attention to what he was actually doing in those meetings. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, greeted me with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widows. "Mrs. Coleman, I was so sorry to hear about Richard. He was such a distinguished gentleman, always asking about my grandchildren and remembering their names." "Thank you, Helen," I said, settling into the leather chair across from her polished desk. "He spoke fondly of you too. I need to understand my financial situation. Richard handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm rather lost without his guidance." Helen's expression softened with genuine understanding. "Of course, dear. Let me pull up your accounts." She turned to her computer, fingers clicking across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. After a moment, her eyebrows rose dramatically. "Oh my goodness." My heart jumped into my throat. Is something wrong? Have Marcus and Stephanie somehow already gained access to our accounts? "Not wrong exactly," Helen said, her voice filled with surprise. "It's just, there are quite a few accounts here, Mrs. Coleman. Far more than I was expecting for a typical joint banking relationship." Helen printed out a statement and slid it across the polished desk. Let me start with the joint checking account you and Richard used for household expenses. The balance was comfortable enough to cover my basic living expenses for several months. Even with the mansion's high utility costs. Relief flooded through me like warm honey. At least I wouldn't be destitute immediately. Now, Helen continued, still frowning at her computer screen, there's also a savings account in both your names. Another sheet of paper materialized from her printer. This balance was significantly larger. Enough to sustain me for several years. If I was careful with my spending. That's wonderful, I said, feeling some of the crushing weight lift from my shoulders. Richard was always so careful about our emergency fund. Yes, he was incredibly methodical, Helen agreed, but her frown was deepening. But Mrs. Coleman, I'm seeing several other accounts here that I need to verify with you. Some appear to be in your name only. And frankly, I'm surprised you're not aware of them. My name only, I echoed, completely confused. That doesn't sound right at all. Richard managed all our finances. He never mentioned any separate accounts. Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard again, pulling up screen after screen of financial information. According to our records, there are 6 additional accounts, 3 certificates of deposit, 2 money market accounts. And this is particularly interesting. A business trust account that was established 7 years ago. My head began to spin like a carnival ride. I don't understand any of this. Richard never mentioned a business trust to me. What kind of business? May I ask? Helen said carefully. Did your husband ever express any concerns about your family situation? Sometimes our clients establish separate accounts and trusts as a form of financial protection. The question caught me completely off guard. Protection from what? I don't understand what you mean. Helen hesitated, clearly choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. Sometimes when our clients have what we call complex family dynamics, perhaps concerns about inheritance disputes, or external financial pressures from relatives, they take steps to ensure their spouse's long-term financial security. I thought about Richard's behavior over the past few years. How he'd started asking pointed questions about Stephanie's expensive shopping habits and their frequent emergencies that required financial help. How he'd grown unusually quiet whenever Marcus mentioned their mounting credit card debt, or Stephanie's demands for a bigger house in a better neighborhood. Can you tell me more about these accounts? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Helen printed several more pages, the sound of the printer seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet office. The first certificate of deposit has been automatically renewing for 8 years. The second was opened 4 years ago, and the third just 2 years ago. Each time, the deposits were substantial. She handed me the statements, and I stared at the numbers in disbelief. These weren't modest emergency funds. These were substantial amounts of money, enough to buy a house outright, enough to live comfortably for decades without financial worry. How is this possible? I asked, my voice shaking. I never signed anything. I never even knew these accounts existed. Actually, you did sign for them, Helen said gently, pulling out a thick file folder. Your signatures are on all the paperwork, properly dated and witnessed. It appears Richard brought you in to sign documents, probably telling you they were routine banking updates or insurance policy changes. I stared at the papers she showed me, seeing my own signature repeated on forms I didn't remember signing. But looking at the dates, I could place some of them. The day we'd come in to update our address after the city changed our street numbers. The time we'd switched to a new type of checking account that offered better interest rates. He never told me what I was really signing, I whispered, feeling a mix of betrayal and protection. He just said it was paperwork that needed to be handled. It's not uncommon, Helen said carefully. Some spouses prefer to handle financial complexities to avoid causing stress or confusion. And legally, everything is completely above board. These accounts are legitimately yours, Mrs. Coleman. I tried to process what this meant. While Marcus and Stephanie were measuring my kitchen and planning their renovations, while they were treating me like a burden to be disposed of, I had resources they knew absolutely nothing about. There's one more thing, Helen said, her voice even more cautious now. The business trust account I mentioned. It's been receiving regular transfers from a law firm operating account for the past 7 years. Coleman and Associates Legal Services. I believe that was your husband's practice. Yes, but Richard retired 5 years ago, I said, confusion clouding my thoughts. Marcus told me the law firm was dissolved and the proceeds barely covered the business debts. Helen consulted her screen again, her expression growing more serious. According to our records, the business account is still very much active. There have been regular deposits from client payments, and then systematic transfers to your trust account. Mrs. Coleman, I think you need to speak with your husband's business accountant immediately. There may be much more to your financial picture than you've been told. I left the bank in a complete daze, my leather purse heavy with account statements and printouts that painted a picture I never could have imagined. Instead of driving straight home to face the cold emptiness of that house, I pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop and sat in my car, methodically reading through everything Helen had given me. The numbers didn't lie. Couldn't lie. Somehow, without my conscious knowledge, Richard had been systematically and secretly protecting me. Every account, every investment, every trust fund was structured to ensure I would be financially independent, no matter what happened to him or to our family relationships. As I studied the trust account statements more carefully, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The deposits corresponded almost exactly with Marcus's visits over the past 7 years. Always larger amounts after Marcus had asked his father for small loans to help with various financial emergencies, or when Stephanie had made her subtle hints about their mounting credit card debt and her desire for a more luxurious lifestyle. Richard had been giving our son money regularly, but he'd been protecting an equal or greater amount for me, as if he'd somehow known that someday I might need to stand completely on my own, without depending on anyone's mercy or generosity. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Mom, Stephanie found a realtor who specializes in estate sales. She can start showing the house next week. Hope you're making good progress on finding a suitable place. Time is running out. I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked again at the bank statements spread across my lap. Marcus and Stephanie were so confident, so absolutely certain they held all the cards in this cruel game. They had no idea that their carefully laid plans were built on a foundation of assumptions they didn't understand. Tomorrow, I would call Richard's business accountant. I would find out exactly what else my husband had left behind, and why Marcus had lied to me about the law firm being dissolved. And then I would decide what to do with the knowledge that Richard had loved me enough to ensure I'd never be at anyone's mercy again. The accounting office of Morrison & Associates sat in a professional complex near Northwestern University, surrounded by other legal and financial services. I'd never been here before. Richard had always handled all business meetings himself, claiming they were boring number-crunching sessions that would only give me a headache. Now I understood he'd been protecting me from more than just tedious paperwork. Margaret Morrison appeared to be about my age, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a professional chignon and kind eyes behind designer glasses. She'd been handling Coleman & Associates books for over 18 years. And her expression when I'd called the previous day had been carefully neutral but tinged with genuine sympathy. Mrs. Coleman, she said warmly, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her organized desk. "First, please accept my deepest condolences. Richard was not only a brilliant attorney, but a truly decent man. I'm going to miss our quarterly meetings more than you know." "Thank you, Margaret. I wish I could say I knew him as well in business as you did." I settled into the chair, my purse containing the bank statements tucked safely beside me. I'm trying to understand our complete financial situation. And the bank mentioned ongoing business income that I wasn't aware of. Margaret's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "You weren't aware? That's highly unusual. Richard spoke about you constantly during our meetings, and I always assumed you were fully informed about the business operations." "Please," I said, leaning forward with desperate curiosity. "I need to understand what's been happening. My son told me the law firm was dissolved years ago and barely covered its debts when Richard retired." "Dissolved?" Margaret looked genuinely confused, even concerned. "Mrs. Coleman and Associates wasn't dissolved. It was restructured into a limited liability company and then transferred into a family trust. You're listed as the primary beneficiary and decision maker." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. "I'm the owner of Richard's law practice." "Well, the trust owns it. And you control the trust completely. It's been remarkably successful. Actually." She turned to her computer, pulling up detailed financial files. "Your husband was extremely strategic about the restructuring. He focused on high-value clients, specialized legal services, and built a sustainable practice that generates steady income rather than the feast or famine cycle of general law practice." Margaret printed out several pages of financial statements and handed them to me with obvious pride. "These are the profit and loss statements for the past 7 years, Mrs. Coleman. As you can see, the firm has been generating very consistent and substantial revenue." I stared at the numbers, my hands trembling as the implications became clear. The annual profits were more than substantial. They were enough to explain every deposit I'd seen in the trust account statements, and much more. "But Richard retired," I said weakly. "He wasn't working anymore. He was home with me every day. He stepped back from day-to-day client interaction." "Yes," Margaret explained patiently. "But he maintained complete oversight of all major cases and strategic decisions. The actual legal work has been handled by his junior partners, David Chun and Sarah Williams, both brilliant attorneys he mentored for years." I nodded numbly. I remembered David and Sarah from office parties and holiday gatherings. They'd both been at Richard's funeral, visibly grief-stricken and genuinely kind to me. Richard structured the partnership so that David and Sarah receive substantial performance bonuses based on the firm's success, Margaret continued. This has kept them motivated, loyal, and completely committed to maintaining the quality of work Richard demanded. It's been an incredibly successful arrangement for everyone involved. Why didn't Richard tell me any of this? The question came out as barely a whisper. Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the question. "Mrs. Coleman, this might not be my place to say, but Richard was deeply concerned about certain family pressures. He mentioned that your son had been experiencing significant financial difficulties and that his wife had very expensive tastes and expectations. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. He was protecting me from my own family. Richard worried that if the family knew about the continued business income and the trust structure, there would be constant pressure and demands that might compromise your future security," Margaret said gently. "He wanted to ensure that you would always be financially independent, regardless of what happened to family relationships. He was protecting both of you in different ways," Margaret continued carefully. "The financial assistance he provided to Marcus over the years was substantial, but it came from a separate business operating account, not from your personal trust assets. and Richard was extremely careful to document everything properly. She pulled out another thick file folder. This one marked Coleman Family Loans in Richard's familiar handwriting. These are copies of all the loan agreements between the business and your son. Richard insisted on treating them as formal business transactions with payment schedules, interest rates, and legal documentation. I opened the folder with shaking hands, my heart pounding as I saw page after page of loan documents. Each one was signed by both Richard and Marcus, witnessed and notarized properly. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars. Over the past 7 years, supposedly for Marcus's various business investments and emergency expenses. Has Marcus been making payments on these loans? I asked, though I already suspected the devastating answer. Margaret's expression grew uncomfortable and professionally distant. The payment records show significant arrears, Mrs. Coleman. As of last month, the outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $127,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. Marcus owed the family business, MY Business, nearly $130,000 while simultaneously claiming his father had left nothing behind but debts and an over-mortgaged house. What happens to these loan obligations now? I asked, my voice barely audible. They transfer with all other business assets. As the new controlling owner of the trust, you have the complete legal right to demand immediate payment, restructure the terms, or pursue collection through the courts if necessary. I thought about Marcus and Stephanie measuring my kitchen, planning their renovations, discussing when they could start showing their house to potential buyers. They were so confident, so absolutely certain they deserved everything Richard had built through decades of hard work and careful planning. There's one more thing you should know, Margaret said, her voice even more careful now. 3 weeks ago, your son contacted me directly. He said that with his father's death, he would be taking over management of all business affairs. He asked me to prepare transfer of ownership documents and demanded access to all financial records. My blood turned to ice. And what did you tell him? I told him I would need written authorization from the actual trust beneficiary. From you, Mrs. Coleman. He seemed genuinely shocked that you were involved in the business structure at all. So, Marcus had been planning to claim the law firm along with the house, assuming I was too grief-stricken and financially naive to understand what was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. This wasn't just greed. It was a calculated plan to leave me with nothing. Margaret, I need to ask you something confidential, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. If I wanted to maintain the current business structure with David and Sarah, continuing to handle the legal work, would that be feasible? Absolutely, she replied with obvious relief. David and Sarah have both been hoping to hear from you, actually. They're very concerned about the firm's future and their own job security. If you're willing to maintain the status quo, I think you'd find them incredibly reliable, grateful, and professionally competent. I gathered up all the papers, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. The law firm was mine. The substantial debt Marcus had accumulated was real, legally enforceable, and documented with professional precision. And neither he nor Stephanie had any idea that their cruel plans were built on a foundation of lies and dangerous assumptions. I'd like to schedule a meeting with David and Sarah as soon as possible, I said, standing up with more confidence than I'd felt in weeks. And I want to understand all of my legal options regarding the outstanding loans. Of course. Shall I arrange a meeting for tomorrow morning? Yes, please. And Margaret? I paused at the door. I'd appreciate it if this conversation remained completely confidential for now. Absolutely. Client confidentiality is sacred in this business, Mrs. Coleman. As I drove home through the busy Chicago streets, my phone buzzed with another text from Stephanie. Margaret, the realtor wants to schedule a professional photographer for tomorrow morning. Make sure the house is spotless and decluttered. First impressions are everything for serious buyers. I stared at the message for a long moment before tucking my phone away without responding. Let them plan their photography session. Let them continue measuring rooms and imagining their future in my house. Spending money they thought they'd inherit. They had no idea that the foundation they were building their dreams on was about to crumble beneath their feet. Like a house of cards in a hurricane. David Chun and Sarah Williams arrived at the house the next morning, both looking professionally composed but emotionally uncertain. I'd invited them to meet in Richard's study, surrounded by his law books and the family photos that told the story of our life together. David, now in his early 40s with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had worked with Richard for over 12 years. Sarah, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s with auburn hair and a confident handshake, had been with the firm for 8 years. Mrs. Coleman, David began formally. First, please accept our deepest condolences. Richard wasn't just our mentor and business partner. He was like a father to both of us. His guidance shaped not just our careers, but our understanding of what it means to practice law with integrity. Thank you both, I said, settling into Richard's leather chair behind his massive oak desk. He spoke of you constantly and with such pride. You were the children he never had professionally. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. Mrs. Coleman, we need to be honest with you about something. Marcus contacted us directly last week. He said he'd be taking over the business and that we should prepare for significant changes in leadership and direction. My jaw tightened. What kind of changes? He talked about liquidating assets, selling the client list to larger firms, and converting everything to cash for estate distribution, David said carefully. He also mentioned that our employment would be evaluated based on the family's financial needs. I felt anger rising in my chest like a tide. And what did you tell him? We told him we'd need to speak with whoever had legal authority over the business, Sarah replied. Richard had always been very clear that if anything happened to him, we should wait for proper authorization from the actual owner. Which is me, I said quietly. Both attorneys nodded, relief visible on their faces. I want you both to know that I intend to maintain the business exactly as Richard structured it, I continued. You've built something remarkable together, and I have no intention of destroying what took years to create. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, just as I'd expected. Through the front window, I could see Marcus's BMW and Stephanie's Mercedes parked aggressively in my circular driveway, as if they already owned the place. I opened the door before they could use their key, a presumption that would have infuriated Richard. Stephanie pushed past me into the foyer, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown to destruction. Margaret, we need to talk, now. Marcus's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing. That David Chun called me this morning and said he couldn't provide business information without your authorization. What did you tell him? I closed the door calmly and turned to face them. They were both standing in the center of the living room, positioned between me and the exit in what I recognized as an intimidation tactic that might have worked on the old Margaret. I told him to follow proper legal procedures, I said pleasantly. Your father would have expected nothing less. Legal procedures? Stephanie's voice rose to a shrill pitch. Marcus is Richard's son and legal heir. What more authorization does anyone need? Actual ownership, I replied calmly, walking to the antique secretary where I'd carefully arranged all the documents Margaret Morrison had given me, which requires actual legal authority. Marcus's eyes narrowed dangerously. What are you talking about, Mom? Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor, which means I control all assets until probate is settled. Actually, Marcus, that's not quite accurate, I said, opening the leather folder containing the trust documents. Your father's will does leave his personal possessions and this house to the family. But Coleman and Associates Legal Services isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 7 years. I set the trust documents on the coffee table between us, watching as the color drained from both their faces. Coleman and Associates has been owned by the Coleman Family Trust since 2017, I continued, calmly. I am the sole beneficiary and controlling decision-maker of that trust. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie lunged for the documents first, her perfectly manicured hands shaking as she tried to make sense of the legal language. Marcus read over her shoulder, his face growing pale as the implications became clear. This is impossible, Stephanie whispered. You don't know anything about running a business. You've never even balanced a checkbook. You're absolutely right, I agreed pleasantly. I didn't know anything about business. Your father handled all of that, but apparently, he understood things about our family situation that I was too trusting to see. Marcus sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. But the business was struggling. Dad always said the margins were tight, that there was barely enough to keep the doors open. The business has been remarkably profitable, actually, I said, handing him the financial statements Margaret had prepared. Here are the detailed records for the past 7 years. Watching Marcus's face as he processed the numbers was like watching someone realize they'd been playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess. The profits were substantial, consistent, and had been flowing directly into my trust account while he struggled with mounting debts. These profits, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Where did this money go? Some of it went to you, Marcus. Quite a lot of it, actually. I pulled out the loan documentation with steady hands. $127,000 over 7 years. To be precise. Stephanie grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. These say, loans, Marcus. You told me those were gifts from your father. You said he was helping us get established financially. They were gifts, Marcus said desperately, but his voice lacked any conviction. Dad never asked for payments. He never mentioned payment schedules or interest rates. Actually, he did, I said quietly. Margaret Morrison has detailed records of every conversation, every missed payment, every time your father chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you legally owed. I watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in like a slow-acting poison. Marcus had built his entire financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He'd probably borrowed against those expectations, made commitments and promises based on money he thought was guaranteed. But this doesn't change anything about the house, Stephanie said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate, almost hysterical edge. The house still belongs to Marcus. That's worth more than some little law firm. Is it? I asked mildly, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. Stephanie's eyes flashed with something between rage and panic. Don't play games with U.S. Margaret. This house is worth at least $600,000. We've already had it appraised. You're absolutely right about the value, I agreed. It's a magnificent property. Of course, there is the small matter of the mortgage. Marcus looked up sharply, confusion replacing his earlier defeat. What mortgage? Dad told me the house was completely paid off years ago. It was, I said calmly, that 2 years ago, your father took out a substantial home equity loan against the property. The proceeds were transferred directly into the Coleman Family Trust account. I pulled out the final set of documents. The ones I discovered in Richard's private files just yesterday, filed carefully in a folder marked Emergency Protection Fund. A home equity loan for $450,000, I continued, watching their faces with fascination. Which means the house has a current mortgage balance of approximately $420,000 after payments. Stephanie's face went completely white. That's impossible. We would have known. We would have had to sign something. Your father was the sole legal owner of the house at the time, I interrupted smoothly. I was listed as a spouse with survivorship rights, but not as a co-owner. He didn't need anyone else's signature for the loan. Marcus stared at the mortgage documents like they were written in hieroglyphics. But why would he do this? Why would he mortgage our family home just to put money in a business account? For the first time since this confrontation began, I allowed my carefully controlled emotions to show. Because he was protecting me, Marcus. He was ensuring that no matter what happened to him, I would never be financially dependent on anyone else's mercy or generosity. Protecting you from what? Marcus's voice was hoarse with disbelief and growing understanding. From this, I said, gesturing to the scene playing out in my living room. From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden rather than a person. From being left with nothing while everyone else claimed what they thought they deserved. Stephanie's composure finally cracked completely. You manipulated him. You convinced a sick, dying man to change everything. Your father wasn't dying. When he established these trusts, Stephanie, I replied calmly, he was planning. And the fact that he felt the need to plan for this exact scenario should tell you everything you need to know about how he viewed our family dynamics. Marcus's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. Mom, surely we can work something out. You don't really want to run a law firm. And this house, it's been our family home for decades. It is staying in the family, Marcus, I said firmly. It's staying with me. But the mortgage payments, Stephanie said desperately. How will you possibly afford the mortgage payments on a fixed income? The same way your father planned, I replied. With income from Coleman and Associates. David and Sarah assure me the business is extremely stable. And Margaret Morrison calculated that the cash flow will easily cover the mortgage with plenty left over for my comfortable retirement. I stood up, smoothing my dress with dignity. Now, I believe you mentioned something about me moving out. I think that's still an excellent idea, just not for me. I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to make a fresh start. Marcus looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in decades. Mom, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, everything our family has meant to each other. Your father did do everything for me, I interrupted. He loved me. Enough to ensure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, including my own sons. And now I finally understand just how much I needed that protection. As they left, I sat alone in the sudden quiet of my house, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was completely and utterly free. So now I want to hear from you, my friends. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to stand up to family members who tried to take advantage of your kindness? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences might help other people facing similar situations. And if this story moved you, I've got 2 more incredible true stories appearing on your screen right now that I know will absolutely amaze you. Click on either one and prepare to be shocked by what people are capable of when they're pushed too far. Thanks for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know.